Hi everyone, welcome back to Intro to Biology for Majors, or BIOL 1224. This PowerPoint is going to cover Chapter 6, which is the second module of this course, so this comes before your second exam. This is from your Openstax book, Biology 2E, and the title is The Energy of Life, and we're going to try to answer the question, how do cells manage their... Okay, so as always, let's start off with our objectives. So we want to be able to recognize the characteristics of metabolism. We want to be able to apply the first and second law of thermodynamics to biological processes. We want to examine the role of ATP in metabolism, and we want to describe the role of enzymes in metabolism. So this slide just covers some basic concepts that we need to understand in order to continue with the PowerPoint. So energy is the ability to do work or to move matter. So we've talked in previous slideshows about how our cells use energy in the form of ATP, or adenine triphosphate. So that's what we're covering within this module as well. Most life forms on Earth get their energy from the sun. Plants are producers, and they use photosynthesis to capture sunlight. And consumers, like us, for example, will eat those plants to obtain energy. So our cells extract energy from food to power all of our muscles, and 1 calorie is defined as the amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And I think we talked a little bit about this in the very first PowerPoint that we covered for the semester, but we're going to dig into that a little bit more. So when we say a calorie, we are talking about the type of calorie that you've heard about before, and a calorie is energy. So we're talking about the amount of energy required to raise a gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That is 1 calorie. Okay, so now let's talk about metabolism. So you've all probably heard about metabolism before. We have, when we're young, a very normally quick metabolism. It sort of helps us to, burn through our food and gain the energy that we need every day quickly. And then as we age, it sort of starts to fall off, and we have a harder time sort of digesting and losing weight and things like that. So this is what you've heard about before. So metabolism includes a variety of reactions that maintain homeostasis. So we talked about homeostasis in the last PowerPoint. It's that equilibrium that our bodies are always looking for. So anabolic pathways are those that require energy to synthesize larger molecules, and that's anabolic pathways. So then you have catabolic pathways, which are those that generate energy by breaking down larger molecules. So once again, anabolic pathways require energy to synthesize or to break down or use large molecules, and catabolic pathways they generate energy by breaking down large molecules. So they're the opposite of one another. So anabolic requires energy, catabolic makes energy. Both types of pathways here are required for maintaining the cell's energy balance. And on this side of the slide, the left slide, I do have an image here that just kind of shows the basic form of metabolism. So we come up with chemical energy by eating foods and carbs, fats, proteins. We eat those things. Our bodies will generate that energy, right? That energy currency of ATP, and it goes through metabolism using that ATP. And then our body will put off heat and chemical waste like carbon dioxide and water, and that's the product that our body comes up with at the end of this process. So that's the basic breakdown of metabolism. There were just a couple of other points I want to hit or just really go through. So catabolic reactions involve, once again, breaking down, and anabolic reactions involve building up. So that's an easy way to remember that. And metabolism is the sum of an organism's chemical reaction. So if you're thinking about, math, then the sum would be something at the end of it's a product, correct? So metabolism is the sum, it's the product of all of an organism's chemical reactions, whether they be catabolic or anabolic. Okay, so now I want to talk about a couple types of energy. So one type of energy we want to talk about, and there are images on the right side of the slide to sort of try to show you the differences. So first, let's talk about potential energy. So potential energy basically is defined as the potential for something to do work. In potential energy, chemical energy is stored in bonds, and potential energy reminds us of a child standing at the top of a playground slide. So they're not physically going down, but they have the potential to go down that playground slide. So this would be a good example. There's a girl standing at the top of just what looks like maybe a high wall. She's holding a ball, and this is the potential energy. So the potential energy would be then that she would drop or throw that ball down. Potential energy then can be transformed into kinetic energy when she actually takes that action and does that. So potential is a great word because it's not actually happening yet. It just has the potential to happen. So now let's talk about when this action actually takes place. That would be kinetic energy. So this is the energy of movement. So keep in mind, potential, there's chemical energy stored in bonds that's just waiting to be used. But kinetic energy is the energy of movement. It's when it's actually happening. So kinetic energy involves the harvest of stored energy, like muscle contraction, for example. And it, in this example, reminds us of a child sliding down a playground slide. Or in the image that I have here, it reminds us of the potential energy sitting up top of a guy on a bike. And then the energy being let out on this side here is kinetic. So both going up this hill and going down this hill would be kinetic energy because something is actually taking place. There's an action happening. The potential energy is when he's sitting up here at the top of this hill. So a couple other notes that I have include kinetic energy is the energy of movement or motion. Potential energy is just stored energy, which is a good way to remember it. So chemical energy is a type of potential energy stored in chemical bonds. And activation energy is the minimum amount of energy required to initiate a reaction. So in order to activate a reaction, you have to have the minimum amount of energy, or ATP, which is that activation energy. And then enzymes actually lower activation energy. So enzymes are helpful in kind of taking away the necessary energy that you need. So instead of requiring a lot of energy with an enzyme, something will require less in order to take place. So chemical reactions will either absorb or release energy. So now I want to talk about how energy is converted. So energy changes form within biological or living systems, but energy is never created or destroyed. So heat energy is lost at each step of the energy cycle. Heat energy is disordered and cannot be converted back to a useful form of energy. So that's why our bodies release heat in the form of sweat and heat while we're working out and things like that. So that heat can't be converted or used by our body in a helpful way. And so we do release it. So there's an image over here on the left side of the slide that I put up to kind of try to help us walk through. So we start off with energy from the sun. Like we said, most living organisms gain their energy from the sun. And in this example, the first that gains their energy would be producers, right? So like plants, they produce energy for other living beings. So those plants then are eaten by either consumers, animals like us, or those plants, if they die, they're eaten by decomposers. So decomposers would be fungi like mushrooms, bacteria, and worms. Animals, after they die as well, will be then eaten by decomposers, so fungi, bacteria, and worms. And then as a runoff, or what they let out, would be heat energy. So they produce heat energy here. Also, heat energy is a part of that first portion of energy gain from plants as well. So heat energy is lost at nearly every step as it goes through, and we'll kind of dig into that more in a few slides. But just keep in mind that energy is converted and it's never created or destroyed. So there's a couple other notes I want to hit on here. So anabolic pathways require the input of energy to synthesize complex molecules from simpler ones, and we talked about that. So anabolic pathways require energy. So some energy is lost as heat energy during cellular metabolic reactions. So when the cell is going through changes, heat energy is lost. This is good for warm-blooded creatures like us because heat energy helps us to maintain our natural body temperature. Okay, so this slide covers one of our big objectives. This slide covers the 2 laws of thermodynamics, and you've probably heard of these before, and we're going to dig into them a little bit. So the first law of thermodynamics is, like we said in the last slide, energy cannot be created or destroyed. The second law of thermodynamics is that entropy, or disorder, is increasing. Okay, so this image on the right-hand side will kind of show you a little of what I'm talking about, at least with the increasing entropy. So basically, you have liquids, you have solids, and on this side, you see that entropy is increasing. So the figure here, it says entropy is a measure of randomness or disorder in a system. And if you think about it, gases will have a higher entropy than like liquids, and liquids will have a higher entropy than solids. So if entropy is disorder, if you look at this image here, the solid image is very orderly, right? So all of these molecules that these are representing are in line in a very orderly fashion. So they don't have much chaos or disorder going within them. There's not much randomness here. Within a liquid, there's a lot of randomness, right? Because it's viscous, so it's moving around. There's just a lot more randomness or disorder taking place within molecules. And then with a gas, that's something that's free floating, obviously there's going to be a lot of entropy and randomness. So that's why we're saying that entropy is always increasing. So that's to break down that one a little bit. But once again, energy can't be created or destroyed, and energy cannot be created or destroyed, and entropy or disorder is always increasing. Okay, so this slide attempts to really break down chemical reactions in the form of an image to kind of help you understand the difference between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So keep in mind, photosynthesis, this green portion, is what happens in plants, and then cellular respiration, this red portion, is what happens in animals. And I want you to remember that plants are producers, so they do produce energy that then animals and other beings will utilize, so they use that energy, right? So on the left side here, it says that photosynthesis, energy is required, and in cellular respiration, energy is released. So let's look a little bit deeper at that, because it doesn't feel like it makes sense until you really see it. So on the left side of this slide, and on this image, we have light in the form of the sun. That's the energy that will go into this chloroplast, where photosynthesis will take place in the chloroplast here in plants. And then they produce oxygen and sugars that are used by the mitochondria, which is the energy, the powerhouse of the cell, right? They're the big energy maker of our cell. That mitochondria then produces energy for us. So we use that energy the mitochondria makes, and then their product is carbon dioxide and water. So then the product is then taken in again by the plants and used for photosynthesis. So it's a big life cycle that takes place. It's symbiotic. We both gain from it, both plants and animals. So once again, light energy is absorbed by plants. Those plants go through photosynthesis using carbon dioxide, water, and light energy. They make sugars and oxygen that then humans and other animals take in. So we breathe in that oxygen. Our body uses those sugars to make ATP, our energy source for the rest of our body. And then that mitochondria puts off CO2 and H2O, starts the cycle back over again. So it's a really beneficial cycle for both plants and animals. And that's how those chemical reactions really take place. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at ATP. And I do have quite a bit to say about ATP. And please keep in mind, ATP is called adenosine triphosphate, but I don't want you to quote me because it's pronounced a little differently by everyone. So ATP is our energy currency of our body. So ATP carries potential energy in its high energy phosphate bonds. It is the primary energy currency of cells in much the same way that money is the currency that we exchange for things that we need in real life. ATP is used to power the majority of energy requiring cellular reactions. So this on the right side is just an image of ATP. Please don't feel like you have to memorize that. It's just kind of showing you what it looks like. So some of the points I really wanted to hit here are that bonds that link the phosphates are equally high energy bonds that when broken release sufficient energy to power a variety of cellular reactions and processes. So the bonds that link those phosphates together within ATP are broken, and they release that energy that powers cellular reactions and processes in our body. So ATP is actually a small and relatively simple molecule that provides the energy to perform almost all cellular work. ATP is a nucleotide that just temporarily stores energy, and all cells rely on that potential energy, like we talked about, that is stored in ATP to power all of their chemical reactions. ATP actually contains 3 phosphate bonds and 3 phosphates. So ADP, so A and then D as in dog, P, is a diphosphate, which only contains 2 phosphates. So keep in mind that ATP, T as in tree, adenine triphosphate, which is our main form of energy, it contains 3 phosphates because you think of tri, right? TRI. So ADP, which is diphosphate, contains 2 because di would mean 2. And then AMP is a adenine monophosphate, and it only contains 1 phosphate. These molecules store energy in their phosphate bonds, and ATP has more phosphates than the others, and it stores more energy than the others. Most energy transformations in organisms occur in what we call oxidation reduction reactions by the transfer of electrons. And we will get into oxidation reduction reactions later on, but that's actually in another chapter. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about enzymes and enzyme function, which will be the next slide. So I did tell you that enzymes kind of act as a catalyst. They make a reaction easier. They start a reaction up. So a substance that helps a chemical reaction to occur is called a catalyst, and that's what an enzyme is. And the special molecules that catalyzed those biochemical reactions are enzymes. Almost all enzymes are proteins, which are made up of chains of amino acids, and they perform critical tasks which lowers the activation energy of cell reactions and chemical reactions. So we said that the activation energy is the minimum amount of energy needed to start a reaction. So the enzyme assists in lowering that activation energy, which means that we then have to provide less of our ATP energy, which is such a valuable currency in our body. So enzymes will do this by binding to the reactant molecules, and they hold them in such a way as to make the chemical bond breaking and bond forming process take place more readily or more easily. So let's just hit a couple of notes here. So this is kind of an example. The pH of the stomach remains near 2. So enzymes present in the stomach must be capable of functioning at that pH. So that takes place at any place in the body. They have to be able to function where they're located. So their pH and their different reactions have to be able to occur in different places in the body. So enzymes are, once again, chemical catalysts that accelerate a chemical reaction by lowering that lowest level of activation energy. Enzymes do this by binding to the reactant molecules. They hold them in a way that helps the chemical bond breaking and forming happen more rapidly, which increases that rate of reaction. Lack of enzymes can actually prevent homeostasis, so it can prevent our cells from reaching that equilibrium they need, and it can lead to cell death. So whenever we lose out on our enzymes, it's a big issue for our body. Enzymes are proteins. Their structure is impacted by the pH, the temperature, and other conditions taking place where they're located. Optimal conditions result in greater enzyme activity, and a protein that is not folded correctly is then denatured or broken down and recycled. And so enzymes are extremely important. Homeostasis, once again, it requires the regularization of enzymes. Feedback inhibition actually involves the use of a reaction product to regulate its own further production. And the cell responds to the abundance of specific products by slowing down production during anabolic and catabolic reaction. So if there is a lot of something being produced, the body will actually slow down its reactions. And some enzymes are turned off or inhibited by the end product of their reaction. So enzymes can be turned on and off by our body depending on the need. Okay, so let's talk about kind of what that looks like in enzyme function. So one of the hallmark properties, or one of the biggest main properties of enzymes, is that they remain ultimately unchanged by the reactions that they catalyze or by the reactions that they start, so that they can kind of be used over and over. So after an enzyme is done catalyzing a reaction, it releases its products. So let's look here. So how enzymes work, for example, we're going to say that this little bat-looking lady here is the enzyme, and then this little blue guy is the substrate. So there's an active site where that little substrate fits perfectly. So that substrate enters the enzyme right here, and that's called the enzyme substrate complex. The enzyme then breaks up that it starts that reaction, right, which in this case is breaking up that substrate molecule, and then the enzyme releases it, and there's a product of now two different pieces, and that's just one example of how an enzyme will work. So it's taking something in, and then it's breaking that product, it's breaking that initial substrate down into a different product. But as you can see, this enzyme, the little bat-looking girl here, she never changed, and so she can kind of be reused. So once again, lowering that activation energy is a function of enzymes that's very important in our body. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about enzyme limits. So high temperatures will eventually cause enzymes, like a lot of other biological molecules, to denature. So this is kind of a reason that it's not good for our body to have a very high temperature for a very long time, because important things in our bodies, like enzymes, can start to denature or break down. So that's kind of what I wrote in my notes here. It says, since enzymes are proteins, they can be disrupted by heat. They are not composed of carbs or nucleotides, so the human enzymes function best at our natural body temperature of around 98.6 Fahrenheit. So the pH of the local environment can also affect the enzyme, either positively or negatively. So if they're at a sort of neutral, happy pH for the portion of our body it needs to be in. So if it's the stomach, it needs to be at about 2. But if it's somewhere else within our body, it could be 7 or even 8 or 9. So the pH of the local environment where that enzyme is found can affect the enzyme's function. So enzymes are suited to function best within a certain pH range. And as with temperature, extreme values, so whether that be an acidic or basic value of the environment, can cause enzymes to denature or break down. So ATP synthase is an enzyme that uses a proton gradient to form ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. So it forms adenine triphosphate from adenine diphosphate. So this image over here just kind of shows you a little of what I was talking about. So it's another form of that little bat that we looked at in the last one. This is your enzyme that should be left unchanged, and then your substrate. But in this example, the heat is above 40 Celsius, so this is higher than it needs to be. Now the enzyme comes out looking kind of wonky and different, right? So the activation side of the enzyme changes shape and can no longer bind to the substrate that looks like a heart, for example. It has been denatured, so it's been broken down or changed. And that's a negative thing within our body, because then we can't use that enzyme again. Okay, so now we've made it to our key takeaways again. So there's 4 here, and the first is that metabolism is vital to homeostasis, or vital to equilibrium within our body. Anabolic reactions will build molecules, and catabolic reactions will break them down. And that's important for the whole function of metabolism, because metabolism is a combination of all of those reactions within our body, both anabolic and catabolic. Okay, so the second is that the laws of thermodynamics govern the fundamental reactions of photosynthesis, which happens in plants, and cellular respiration, which happens in animals. So once again, those are beneficial for both plants and animals, and the laws of thermodynamics that we learned govern those reactions. Now, ATP carries potential energy, and it is high energy phosphate bonds. It is the primary currency of the cell, so it's a lot like the money of the cell. And enzymes are usually proteins. They lower the lowest activation energy for reactions. So that's the end of this chapter. If you all have any questions, please email me and go ahead and move on to the next chapter for this module.